Our next two speakers now from Belgium will talk about the situation in Belgium. So first it's Vanessa McCulloch and then Ellie. So over to you, Vanessa.
I'm a teacher in an international school in Belgium, and I came to Belgium in 2006. I grew up in England. I studied and worked in Scotland. I worked in Scotland just in the state system, and then I moved to the Netherlands, where I also worked in the international system. I think my story with regards to becoming alerted to this issue probably follows a very similar trajectory to other people. I know that many people have been discussing it much longer, but I think I probably was alerted to the problem, when I saw Maria McLachlan assaulted by Tara Woods. And then I further was, Munro Bergdorf's assertion that women should not centre their female biology on International Women's Day. And then also Posey Parker's campaign and the sort of horror that's the words adult, human, female seem to cause people to have when she projected those as part of her activism on the building. In London. I was abused online for saying that male-bodied people shouldn't be housed in women's prisons in an opinion group that I was on, and those sort of online spaces became kind of unavailable to me because of my views. I followed the debate mainly in Britain because that's my nationality, and my first nationality. I became Belgian in 2016, and I was really inspired by what happened there and the resistance that women have shown to things like the Gender Recognition Act and the consultation that occurred. I'm going to cover a little bit about Yogyakarta Principles, EU, because obviously Belgium as a member state of the EU is influenced by EU politics, and also a little bit about Belgium as a country that now has self-ID without any supporting medical documentation required for to change your legal gender. So there are also tensions, for example, between CEDAW and other EU and EU policy direction. And I think some of these are characterized by something that many people would have noticed, which is that constant conflation of sex and gender in policy language and discussion, which I think really messes things up. Yogyakarta Principles were first established in 2006. They're constantly cited in various situations and documents as being best practice. And they're often seen as the sort of origins of gender identity, starting to supersede the importance of sex, and the promotion of gender identity or gender expression as overriding the significance of sex, and they do have an influence on EU thinking. So EU policy does not currently compel any member state to adopt self-ID as their means of changing your gender, but it's kind of encouraged. And I think if you look at the table there, you can see that the countries that are in cluster 5 on the table, these are kind of seen as leading the way, and the implication is that other countries should aspire to this. These are the countries that already have self-ID: Belgium, Denmark, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, and Portugal. Gender identity, gender reassignment, gender expression is not listed in Article 21 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which lists other bases of discrimination, the sort of thing that you would expect to see on such a list: sex, race, colour, ethnic or social origin, all of those, language, religion, disability, all of those things that you would expect to see. So member states in the EU have to protect against discrimination on the basis of these characteristics. They can add additional ones if they wish to, but they can't take away those ones that are listed from those ones that are listed there. Article 23 refers to equality between men and women, and it does refer to sex. So the risk comes from adding gender identity characteristics in a way that conflates them with sex. So in the much talked about UK Equality Act of 2010, the separate characteristic of gender assignment was added, but not placed alongside sex. It's a separate characteristic. All individual member states, but not the EU as a body, are committed to the implementation of policy aligned to the goals and principles of CEDAW, the Istanbul Convention, which does have some reference to gender identity, but refers to men and women throughout and attributes female experiences, for example, maternity, to women. It refers to the sexes, for example, in Article 5, although CEDAW also committee also needs to provide real clarification. Here in Belgium, we have the Institute of Equality of Men and Women, and there you can see that actually these things are very much conflated. All of the trans rights stuff, those issues and information are found alongside women's rights issues and information. However, you can still bring gender identity cases under the auspices of the sex characteristic. And I think, this is comparable to what Biden is doing now. Again, it's that conflation, that placing of gender and sex together. So for example, a trans woman, a male-born person, claims discrimination on the grounds that they've been discriminated against because of their female sex, because they are a woman. From this archived page, I found an explanation from Sylvain Agius in 2010, where he stated, luckily the case of the European Court of Justice fills the gap. He's referring to a lack of a legislation about trans rights. The court has interpreted discrimination on the basis of sex to also refer to people who have had gender reassignment. I think it might be worth considering that gender reassignment in 2010 might have possibly meant something quite different. I don't think it would have meant at the time, it may or may not have meant a certificate on the basis of self-ID. So he's saying all EU sex discrimination law could thus apply to transgender people. Today, Agius is on the team of Helena Dalli, who is the EU Commissioner for Equality. Also in the Council of Europe, policy moves in favour of gender ideology, and I just looked and gave an example there as with reference to education, because that's my area, because that's, as a teacher, I think about how it applies there. And in one particular section, which discusses sex segregated spaces in schools, it's discussed in a way that describes it as posing challenges for the trans-identifying minor, but there's, pretty much no discussion at all about resolving issues in relation to the challenges that might be experienced by existing users. And this seems to characterize a lot of documentation that I see, that the trans-identifying student, trans student is centered really in everything without sufficient consideration or equal weighting given to those that are using the spaces already that the trans student would like to identify into, as it were. There's some vague mention of this in point 35 that suggests that schools could have some flexibility. If we move on to Belgium, it's a very complicated country. We have a population just of 11 million. We're a young country, and we've got 3 different language communities and multiple parliaments and political and cultural differences between Flemish and Walloon communities. I live in Antwerp, which is Flemish speaking, and it's really nice that Ellie, whose presentation will follow mine, she's based in Brussels. So you are able today to get perspectives from the two major language communities. In Belgium, self-ID is allowed. This law came into effect in 2018 from the 1st of January, and it means that no supporting medical documentation from a doctor or a counsellor is required to accompany applications. And it's available to Belgians aged 16 plus, although between the ages of 16 and 18, minors are required to provide a short declaration signed by a child psychologist or psychiatrist. There's a reflection period. It's only about 3 to 6 months between the two declarations. On the next slide, you'll see a little time frame about how it happens. And all your markers get changed on your official documentation to your desired sex classification. Now, what's clear is that this is a process that's very difficult to reverse once the legal change has been made. And this, I think, is the essential problem with it. Of course, the difficulty is there in order to prevent supposedly frivolous applications, but I think it is going to be hugely problematic for young people who perhaps become locked into identities that no longer apply to them, or at worst have become distressing to them. In other words, detransitioners, young people who regret their decision. And I think especially given the rising number of females presenting at gender clinics, this is something that is, a women's issue too. So to summarize the situation, it's quite easy. In 6 months, you can change your documentation, but the reversal is very difficult. And this shows kind of the start and end. I'm sorry, this is in Dutch. So the start involves putting your first declaration in at your local authorities. We have like a districthuis, gemeente, I think it's a commune in the French-speaking part of the country. And then it goes to the procureur des Konings. I think a king's attorney would be a good translation of that. Like when I but when I got Belgian nationality, it went to that office as well, my whole file when I applied for Belgian nationality. Then it comes back, you put in a second declaration, and 6 months after the very start of the procedure, the changes can be happening. Here you can see there's a big spike when this change occurred. So a huge spike in numbers of people wanting to now change their legal gender. And that's maybe something that might have been expected, although it is indeed a very high spike. But you can also see a leveling off of the sexes of the people that are applying for this procedure, to the extent the last blue column is, you've got the same numbers of men and women, males and females applying. So I'm in Flanders and in schools. I have 3 children. They're all in the Belgian system. I teach in the international system, as I mentioned, but my 3 children are all at different stages. So I went to check out the official education website of Flanders, and there was a page about transgender students which actually outlined the changes in self-ID law and then looked at what that would mean in schools. To a certain degree, I think in some ways they are kind of fairly non-committal and not, again, forcing schools to move people into to be allowed to always identify into sex segregated spaces. So in toilets, for example, the schools aren't actually obliged to provide separate toilet facilities for boys and girls. The page suggests making toilets gender inclusive, in other words, mixed sex, as I would say. And there's this constant reference to asking the student what they want, and then seeing if it can be supported by the school, but always starting, again, centering the trans-identifying student. I think many people watching will be aware that mixed-sex toilets are less safe for girls. So as a teacher, again, that I would see that as a safeguarding concern, as I would for the next area, the PE lessons, asking the student what they prefer, but it does at least allow also for the necessity of consulting other students. It doesn't answer questions about playing on teams. It seems especially unsafe, I think, for trans-identifying females to be in contact sports, and also, you know, in teams when you play other schools. I think there's an issue for the team that you are playing against about how they would feel, and these things are not really resolved or answered on that. Again, sleeping arrangement, it's as per, but emphasizes that a trans student who's advanced in the transition process is best placed, according to the page, with the group to which they are transitioning. And I think, again, that is a safeguarding concern. And I think, you know, we also need to remember that, you know, with all the sort of pressure on girls to be nice and be kind that we're aware of, that even if you do consult girls and ask them what they think about, they might well feel a strong pressure to say that they're comfortable when they're not. In conclusion, I haven't found much opposition to gender ideology here. And when the law went through, for example, to say the self-ID law went through, it just did not seem to provoke the reaction, for example, that it did in the UK, where it seemed to really light a touch paper under feminism and feminists, and who did an amazing job of highlighting the conflict between trans rights and women's rights. I have great safeguarding concerns as a teacher. And there are a couple of links there where you might want to, if you are in Belgium, you can contact a government department. And there's a list of MEPs there as well. Transparencia is a site that I discovered recently where it works like freedom of information. If you can't see the information that you want, you could put your request for information in there. I've kind of just tested that out recently. So I've asked the Justice Department how many trans-identifying males are in women's prisons at the moment, and I'm waiting to see how the site works and if I get an answer with that. So that is the situation at the moment. I suppose I've got a bunch of links and resources which you're welcome to share. I suppose my key message at the moment might be for those people that are not in that cluster 5 of the diagram that we saw earlier, the table that we saw earlier, to just be aware how it seems that this legislation really just kind of glided silently in to Belgian law with very little opposition or discussion that I could identify in news or opinion pieces or in feminist groups.